a nonprofit devoted to popularizing these topics. This talk will be about the Pro-Truth Pledge. If you have a copy of the newsletter, I will say the places that he has been published and appeared as a guest really do read as sort of a list of places that we might like to hang out and read interesting articles. So without further ado, I will turn this over to Dr. Sapersky.
Thank you very much. Can everyone hear me? Say yes. Yes. Excellent. Thank you. I appreciate that kind introduction, Carol. And I appreciate all of you gathering here to chat about fighting fake news and post-truth politics using science. So that is the purpose of this talk. And the first thing I will do as an academic, as a professor, is define terms. You know, you're probably unsurprised to hear a professor starting by defining terms. So what is post-truth politics? That's a question I get asked often. What is this thing? And this is something that Oxford Dictionary chose as its word of the year in 2016. And that's the word of the year, relating or denoting circumstances in which objective facts are less influential in shaping public opinion than appeals to emotion and personal belief. So basically appeals to emotions, to personal beliefs. Now, we as humanists, and I'm personally a humanist, that's my belief system, really focus on facts, logic, reason as the basis for our perceptions, for our perspectives, for our love and care for humanity from a non-theistic perspective. That's what we focus on. Now, unfortunately, we are different than a large proportion of the population which don't really orient toward facts, and that is the portion of the population which is very often impacted by appeals to emotions, appeals to personal beliefs over facts. So post-truth politics refers to a situation where those appeals, especially to that part of the population, shape the public discourse. They shape public opinion and are more effective than appeals to truth. Now, Oxford Dictionary chose this definition, this word, as its word of the year in 2016 after the victory of Donald Trump in the US presidential election and the Brexit side in the UK Leave election, because both of those campaigns used quite a bit more deceptive tactics, deceptions, lies, than their opponents. So Oxford Dictionary chose it to signal that post-truth politics is winning in our current political discourse, both in the UK and in the US. So that was the nature of the word. That was why it was chosen. That's post-truth politics. Now, let's talk a little bit about what post-truth politics looks like. You know, this is a kind of dictionary definition. It's very high level. What does it look like on the ground level? So this is an example of what post-truth politics looks like. You know, there was an advertisement campaign launched by people who wanted to suppress the votes for African Americans, saying that they can text to vote for Hillary Clinton. Now, of course, we all know that you can't actually text your vote. That's not something that can actually happen. Your vote will not count. Unfortunately, there are a number of people who don't know that, and especially younger people who use Twitter. And they were fooled by texting to vote. There were a number of people who actually texted their votes to this number, to 59925, text Hillary, and they were duped. They didn't go out on election day. So this is post-truth, but this is an example of what post-truth politics looks like on the ground level. Now, there were many similar tactics with voter suppression, not simply of African Americans, but also of Bernie Sanders supporters, so kind of people who weren't fans of Hillary Clinton, and people who were women, so kind of appealing to them, white women. So there were appeals to those. Same tactics were used in the UK Brexit campaign. The Leave side used similar tactics, you know, saying that that they can save 350 million pounds for the UK health system if they left the EU, which is a false claim. Completely false claim, was disproved many times, but they kept using it and it was effective because that's how post-truth politics works. It appeals to people who aren't very discerning, and they don't really take the time to read into the matter of what is this claim about 350 million, or can you really text your vote? Given that Donald Trump won by something like 60,000 votes in key states, there's little question that these tactics were one of the dynamics that helped push him over the edge. So that's post-truth politics. Now, let's talk a little bit about what is fake news. So we're going to go to another dictionary definition first. And this dictionary definition comes from Collins' dictionary. So Collins chose as its word of the year for 2017, so last year, fake news as its word of the year. So it doesn't refer to spin. That's not what fake news talks about. It's completely false stories, often sensationalized, disseminated under the appearance of news. It's not actual news. It's just meant to lie, to deceive, and to look like real news. So that's what fake news is. Now let's talk a little bit about what fake news look like. So here's an example of what fake news looks like. So this person, probably a few of you are familiar with her, but she is pretty famous on Twitter, or was pretty famous on Twitter. Her name is Jenna Abrams, and she was a very prominent alt-right Twitter star who had over 70,000 followers. Now, it turned out later that she was a Russian troll. So she was not an actual person. There was no actual person named Jenna Abrams who looks like that. She was just a Russian troll who Russian officials created a number of false accounts to look like real people, real Americans. And they gained massive following among Americans who were sympathetic to that perspective. And so she was one of them. This is an example of what a distributor of fake news looks like. So what we talked about Twitter, we talked about social media, both of the two examples were Twitter. So let's talk a little bit about how fake news impacts us. And we have to realize it's not only on the right. So this is going to be about how fake news impacts us as a society and where it actually comes from. So there were two rallies held in Houston on Saturday, May 21st at 12 p.m. last year, both at the same time. Now, one was organized by a group called the Heart of Texas. That was one group. And that group organized an event called Stop Islamization of Texas, so this event. Another group was organized by United Muslims of America, called Save Islamic Knowledge at the same time. Now, Heart of Texas had something like 250,000 Facebook followers, and the United Muslims of America had something like 350,000 followers. And so when they organized these events, a number of people came out at the same time, the same place, and of course they were opposed each other because one was stopping Islamization of Texas and the other one was Save Islamic Knowledge. Now, it was later discovered that both of these were organized by Kremlin trolls. Both of these were organized by Kremlin trolls, same sort of person that Jenna Abrams was. So real Americans went out on the street and fought each other, had conflict with each other on the ground level because of this. And this can happen anywhere. This can happen in Connecticut. It just happened in Houston, Texas. It happened across the country. These sorts of things happened across the country and keep happening right now. So Russian trolls were implicated in spreading conspiracy theories around the Parkland shooting, for example. And there are many, many more present examples that happened. So it happens. It not only impacts people on the right. The United Muslims of America was a left-oriented organization, and Heart of Texas was a right-oriented organization. And they both fell into this fake news and post-truth politics. So this, as we can see, is a major problem that really impacts us. Now, let's talk a little bit about how many people are actually exposed to fake news. This is really hard to evaluate, surprisingly hard to evaluate. So Facebook, for example, is not really, Facebook is in the news for a data breach which exposed many, many, many millions of people to the Cambridge Analytica, which is a conservative company which uses data mining to promote conservative causes. It was the major data backer of the Trump campaign and the Leave campaign alike in the UK. So in the UK, the Leave campaign, the major data mining and cyber propaganda company was Cambridge Analytica, and it was also the company that was the data company and the propaganda company behind the Trump campaign. So that's was in the news recently, but even before that, it was shown that at least 150 million Americans were exposed to fake news created by Russia alone. We're not talking about fake news created by Cambridge Analytica. We're talking about created by the Internet Research Agency in Russia. And that's at least 150 million. Facebook is well known for suppressing the number of fake news that comes out on its platform and not revealing that information. Likely, many more people were actually exposed just to fake news created by Russia alone. And of course, many more were exposed to other fake news, not created by Russia. So here we're talking about the nature of the problem. So we have a huge number of Americans exposed to fake news. What about being convinced by fake news? Now, the people here in this room, of course, are sophisticated thinkers. You are oriented toward logic and reason. You are much less likely than the average citizen to be convinced by fake news. Unfortunately, you are atypical. So we have studies showing that the percentage that many Americans believe fake news headlines. 75% of fake news is retained and believed. So here we have some examples of fake headline accuracy perceptions. So that fake headline accuracy perceptions, 84% will perceive a fake news headline as accurate versus a real headline accuracy perception, and so on. And here are some examples of specific headlines. And 75% fake news is both retained and believed. So 84% might believe a fake news headline, but some percentage of these people retain it as well. So it's very unfortunate, and it's a very big problem for our society that these people retain this information and they act on it. So basically, what this perception of fake news headlines should tell you is that whoever has the biggest megaphone is currently winning, regardless of whether they're telling the truth or not. Whoever has the biggest megaphone, they can spread all the fake news that they like, and 3/4 of the population, or 3/4 of that fake news, to be more accurate, will be retained and believed by people. So you have the biggest megaphone, you can get people to believe in lies. Now, this is in combination with the fact that trust in fact-checking organizations has been falling. And this is a big problem for us. So there's a Rasmussen Reports poll from September 30th, 2016, that only 29% of all likely voters trust fact-checking. Only 29%. Of voters who support Trump, only 12% trust fact-checking. By contrast, 59% of Clinton supporters trust fact-checking. So there is a partisan divide, and that's important to recognize. We're not, this is not a presentation where I'll say everyone is, equally guilty or equally to blame. There is a strong and clear partisan divide here, that fake news is shared much more commonly by people on the right than on the left, and this is accompanied by the fact that people on the right are much less likely to trust fact-checkers than people on the left. So we have a big problem here. And one of the reasons for this problem is called confirmation bias. So it's about our psychology. So confirmation bias is that people look for and interpret information in ways that confirms their current beliefs, as opposed to questioning information. So this, again, is a huge problem that we experience. Now, this is something that is a reflection of the current media ecosystem. So prior to the rise of social media and digital media, we had a somewhat different situation, a really distinct situation where the fake news and the post-truth politics was filtered out by mainstream media, which was watched by people. So, when we had the situation where Dan Rather would be a prominent figure who determined the news for many people, and various other news channels or your local news channels, they would filter out the obvious fake news and obvious post-truth politics. They would take that out and they wouldn't broadcast it. So at least there was spin on both sides. We can talk about CNN having spin, Fox News having spin, MSNBC having spin, but they didn't allow purely false news to come into your TV or so on. So there was much less of falsehoods, much less misinformation in that time. Unfortunately, with the rise of digital media and social media, people can choose their own venues, whether they go to Occupy Democrats on the left or Breitbart News on the right. They can go to venues that are not known for withdrawing and retracting any stories, whether they happen to be true or false. And Occupy Democrats and Breitbart aren't the worst of it. I mean, stories created by the Internet Research Agency in Russia are much worse. They are an active foreign threat, which is trying to undermine our society, our democracy, in order to promote Russia's agenda. And you can bet that other countries are learning from Russia and are preparing to do the same thing to the US in the 2018 election and the 2020 election, because the US is the global power, it is the global superpower. And if you can manipulate its population to put a leader into place and other political officials into place who support your agenda, as Putin undoubtedly did in the 2016 election, you're going to be in a much better place. So this is the first part of the presentation. It's about why we are where we are. The second part of the presentation will go into how to solve this problem. But right now, I want to give you an opportunity to ask any questions about how we got here before we talk about how we can address the problem. And so I'll take this off and I will get it back here. So please, if anyone has any questions, I welcome them right now before we continue.
Any questions?
Yeah,
Yeah, you can ask a question here. Why don't I have to do speak into this? It should go through there, and I think he'll hear you. Otherwise, I'll have my
Good evening. I was just wondering, Doctor, if you could explain why the problem of fake news and fake news consumption and lack of skepticism seems to be so much more common on the right than on the left, at least if I'm interpreting your statistics right. Is there any explanation for that fact? Does it lie maybe in the psychology of conservative right, or maybe in some kind of special conspiracy of right-wing forces?
So there is no special conspiracy. I mean, if you think about on the left, you can think to the conspiracy that George Bush was behind 9/11, or if you think on the right, you can think of the conspiracy that Barack Obama wasn't born in the US and is a Kenyan Muslim. So both of those are conspiracies that happened. There are a couple of reasons why people on the right have much more misinformation, are much more implicated in sharing misinformation than people on the left. One of those reasons is alignment with science and reason. So alignment with science is a well-known phenomenon that counters fake news and post-truth politics. And on the large majority of issues, not all issues, people on the left are more aligned with science than people on the right. So if you think about global climate change denial, that is something that is much more associated with people on the right than people on the left. And so that's one of the problems. That's one dynamic. Another dynamic just has to do with geopolitics. Trump, when he came in, so he facilitated a great deal of people on the right bashing mainstream media and welcoming conspiracy theories. You have to remember that Trump was one of the people who was leading the conspiracy theory that Barack Obama is a Kenyan Muslim. So just from the perspective of the leadership, there is a phenomenon called emotional contagion. And that's a well-known behavioral science phenomenon where the emotions and beliefs of the leadership infect, and that's why it's called emotional contagion, they infect followers. So people look at the example set by their leader, Donald Trump, and then they follow that example. So Donald Trump had a major role to play in the growth of acceptance of conspiracy theories by people on the right. And the third element here is geopolitics. So Vladimir Putin, of course, is a major player in this whole dynamic, and Russia. They have developed a very strong cyber propaganda machine using fake news as a tool to promote the Russian agenda. And in this election, the Russian agenda was to stop Hillary, not because Vladimir Putin is a Republican of any sort. For example, Vladimir Putin was in the primary helping Bernie Sanders. We have research showing that he was actually supporting Bernie Sanders because he didn't like Hillary Clinton's treatment of Russia. He knew that she was the biggest of the biggest anti-Russian, let's say, hawk of the candidates. So he would have much preferred that Bernie Sanders win the Democratic nomination and that Donald Trump win the general election. So that's why he was supporting Bernie Sanders during the primaries with Russian fake news and using Russian fake news to support Donald Trump. So those are the three reasons I would say that people on the right have tended to be much more oriented toward fake news.
All right, we got another question.
Do you think that the media itself has contributed? I have seen a spread of misinformation both on the left and the right due to the medium of sharing. People see a headline as it is placed either on Facebook or Twitter, and they don't read the article, and the headline says something substantially slanted or different than the article actually says, but yet it gets shared over and over again because it's very easy to share on Twitter or Facebook. Do you think that has contributed to misinformation on both sides?
So this is a problem much less of the media than such. So I don't want to paint with a broad brush. There are various media on both the left and the right, more extreme on the left. So I gave the example of Occupy Democrats. If you look at the Occupy Democrats and you compare their headlines to a center-left venue like the New York Times, the headline of Occupy Democrats will be much more triggering emotionally. And this is the key to recognize that people believe lies and spread things on Twitter because of emotions. There was a recent study that showed that false information, false news, spreads much quicker and more widely on Twitter, and of course other social media by implication, than real news. Because false news is optimized, fake news is optimized to appeal to our emotions. The emotions that cause people to share things on Facebook tend to be emotions like anger, fear, joy, and humor. And anger and fear and humor sometimes, less so joy, are triggered by headlines in news, by news headlines on the far left and the far right. So these people on the far left and on the far right, like Occupy Democrats and Breitbart, so those organizations, they don't align themselves with the Society for Professional Journalism or the Ethical Journalism Network or other organizations that are where professional journalists stick to a code of conduct. They basically take the mantle of professional journalists and say they are professional journalists, whereas in reality, they're just undermining our democracy through spreading biased information and getting people to share those stories. So our information ecosystem is kind of broken. And that's what I was talking about. It's kind of broken due to confirmation bias, due to these various problems, due to why and how people share information. So the second part of the presentation will be about how we can address our broken information ecosystem of post-truth politics and fake news. Thank you for asking that.
I think we have one more question.
Have you looked at the issue of people spreading fake news and believing in fake news in other countries? And if so, how is it different in other countries from the United States?
So I talked here in the presentation about the UK, and so that's definitely happens in the UK widely. It happens in France and Germany and so on. This is something that happens all over the world. Wherever there is social media, it's happening. Now, for other countries, I would say the only difference, so it does tend to be more conservative people who spread fake news, but less so than in the United States due to the particularly US-oriented factors, like Donald Trump, who is kind of a unique persona in pushing people on the right to spread fake news more. You know, if we had an equivalent person on the left who was coming into power and spreading fake news and misinformation as a basis for his or her platform, I imagine many more people on the left would be spreading fake news. So this is not simply about conservatives. This is about an individual. Now we can talk whether a person on the left would get into a position of power by lying or not. And that's kind of another conversation I want to get into here. But I'm giving an example of if there was such a person, people on the left would be much more likely to share fake news. So that's a particularly US dynamic that's less present in other countries. Another particularly US dynamic is the might of Russia coming down on the US, but Russia has also been implicated in trying to influence elections in the same way in Germany, in France, in Switzerland, in the UK, of course, I mentioned, and elsewhere in Western Europe, and it's near abroad. Other dynamics play out in South America, in Asia, in India, that are less influenced by Russia. So they have their own particular fake news dynamics going on, and they're spread a little bit less on Facebook and Twitter and more on private messaging apps like WhatsApp. So that's kind of a peculiarity of more developing countries, we can say, that use those apps more often.
Okay, here's one more question. I have a friend who periodically forwards to me things from a person who's obviously very much on the right. And one time, it so obviously was a lie that I sent to her quotes from a scientific article which proved it was a lie. My question is, how should I handle this? Should I ask her to forward it to the person who sent it originally, or would that be a waste of time? What suggestions do you have?
So what tends to work in these situations is less showing them that their information is inaccurate than asking them why they believe the article is accurate and why they forwarded it to you. What makes them believe the article is accurate? What makes them think it's credible? So you get them, you don't, it's not, you don't give a man a fish, you teach someone to fish. There's a much more effective technique. So that's what you want to do. You want to ask them questions, you want to get them to do the work, you want them to learn how to fact check. And that's a much more effective technique to get somebody to think about where they're getting information, what they're believing, what is the impact of their actions. Same thing works on Facebook. If any of your friends post an article that you are suspicious about, it's much better to ask a question like, why do you believe that the article is credible? Why did you post it? What makes you, where did you get this information, and so on. That sort of questioning in a non-aggressive manner, in a curious manner, has been shown to be much more effective in getting people to change their behavior than putting forward a link to Snopes or link to PolitiFact or something disproving the article.
Any more burning questions? No, we got one. You tell me when you need to move on to the second half, okay?
Yeah, last question.
You make an equivalency between fake news on the right and fake news on the left. we're all well aware, I think, of what would determine fake news on the right. Can you give me one example of fake news coming from the left?
Of fake news coming from the left?
Yes.
Okay, so fake news coming from the left, there was a piece of fake news I had mentioned about George Bush being behind 9/11. That was a well-known one that I mentioned in the presentation. A more recent one would be that there were 18 school shootings before the Parkland shooting. So that's not actually accurate. You know, the number of shootings, that included counting things like a police officer, a reserve police officer discharging his weapon after the fact, you know, after school, accidentally on the premise of a school, not during work time. When we think of school shootings, that's not what we think of. So that is a clear example of misinformation, of where information given is such that the audience would have an incorrect perception of reality. That's one example. Another example was if we go to a political statement, a statement made by Hillary Clinton that the Wisconsin ID laws cost her the election. That's not actually accurate, as according to factcheck.org and Snopes, which fact-checked this claimant, showed that it was false. They didn't actually cost her the victory. So those are a couple of examples of misinformation coming from the left. All right.
Then we will let you take off for the second half.
Sure. Okay. Everyone can see the screen?
Yes.
Yeah. Yes.
Excellent. All right. So, and this will require, so everyone should have a copy of the Pro-Truth Pledge. And this will require taking a look at the Pro-Truth Pledge. If you don't have pens, consider borrowing one from somebody by you when it comes to considering whether to sign it. So, how do we fight fake news in post-truth politics? This is the question that we're going to deal with in the second half. Now, what the research suggests on how we can fight fake news in post-truth politics is that we need to target private citizens who share fake news. And we need to target public figures, especially politicians who have incentives to deceive. At the same time, we need to unite all people who care about truth and facts together in a shared constituency. We have a problem where people like us, people who care about truth and facts, we feel like we lost our voice in the current post-truth fake news climate. We feel like we can't do anything. We feel disempowered. And that's terrible. We have this feeling, and it's an accurate feeling because we're not a constituency. We don't cohere together. We're not part of a broader movement of people who care about fake news and post-truth politics and want to uplift uplift facts and truth above fake news, above post-truth politics, and give appropriate rewards to people who are fact-oriented, to politicians and journalists and so on who are fact-oriented, and not give rewards, not give credibility to people who are liars. And the Pro-Truth Pledge is a behavioral science-based instrument that does exactly that. It's meant to unite people who care about truth and facts. Unite them together, unite all of you and other people, people who are not necessarily humanists, go outside the skeptic movement, and unite everyone who cares about truth and facts. Like Americans United for Separation of Church and State has a religious leader. We want to get religious people, and we do have religious people as part of this movement. We want to get conservatives as well as liberals as part of this movement, and we do have conservatives and liberals as part of this movement, to unite everyone who cares about truth and facts in a project to roll back lies and fight for truth in public discourse. So what we have done is a team of behavioral scientists, including myself, led by me actually, have looked at what are behaviors that are oriented toward the truth. Now, when we say truth, when we say that statement, speak the truth, it's really a little bit of an empty statement, because if you tell somebody to lose weight but don't tell them how to do it, that really doesn't mean much to a person. You go to your doctor and she tells you, you need to lose weight. Well, what does that mean? What does it mean to lose weight? How do you do it? So this is a big, big problem when we tell somebody to speak the truth and they don't know how to do it. What does it mean to speak the truth? So we looked at the behaviors that are actually associated with speaking the truth, with a truth orientation, with both for yourself, for others around you, and for your community. Pulled them together into an instrument called the Pro-Truth Pledge, which is in front of you. So those are the 12 behaviors that I'm going to be talking about. The Pro-Truth Pledge combines behavioral science and crowdsourcing. The first set of behaviors is about you sharing the truth. So fact-checking information before accepting and sharing it. Sharing the whole truth, even if some aspects don't support your opinion. Sharing your sources so that others can verify what you share, and distinguishing between your opinion and the facts. Now, these are the behaviors that speak to how you as an individual tell the truth and speak the truth and accept the truth. This is about you as an individual, so you sharing the truth. That's the first of 12, that's the first 4 components out of 12 behaviors. The second of 4 components are about honoring the truth. And that's about you engaging with other people, you and another person. So you would acknowledge when somebody you're speaking to, somebody you're engaging with on social media or in person, share true information, even if you disagree on an interpretation, you know. So if you both look at the thermometer outside and you say, okay, this is 70 degrees. Now, the person you're speaking to might say that's too cold, and you might say that's too hot. That's okay, as long as you both agree that it's 70 degrees. You reevaluate if your information is challenged and retract it if you can't reevaluate. You defend others who come under attack for sharing true information, even when you disagree in other ways. So this is a really important one. You defend that person when she comes under attack for sharing true information. And then you align your opinions and your actions with true information. So that's very important to not have a distance between your behaviors and your words and your opinions. So that's the second part of it, honoring true information. And the last one is encouraging the truth. This is about your community, about all the people in your community, especially your allies. You ask people who are your allies to retract information that reliable sources have shown to be incorrect. Then you inform people around you, including your allies, to stop using unreliable sources like Breitbart and Occupy Democrats. I've been bashing those. Then you defer to experts. If somebody is a climate change scientist, then she probably knows much more than you do on climate change. Or if somebody is another scientist, they know much more about you than you do on that topic. So you defer to those experts. That's a really important aspect of being truthful. This is about humility, recognizing the limits of your knowledge and deferring to people with more expertise. And finally, you go against the very, very bad tendency in our society to accuse somebody of being a flip-flopper if they change their minds based on accurate and new information. Instead, you celebrate those who retract incorrect statements and update their beliefs toward the truth. So that's the point of that last behavior. And so this is about your community, how you encourage truth in your community. Now, as you can imagine, the Pro-Truth Pledge addresses many things. It addresses fake news sharing. So we have a study that was done at Ohio State University, 2 studies actually, that those who took the pledge have a much lower statistical likelihood of sharing misinformation. Much lower statistical likelihood. This is a science-based instrument, and it has been evaluated and shown to be accurate, shown to be effective by the research. So this is really fully credible. It's not only science-based, but it is actually effective based on peer-reviewed studies. It addresses the problems like Jenna Abrams, that we mentioned before, and the dueling protest rallies. It addresses post-truth politics. Many politicians took it already. I'm often asked by who is the most prominent politician who took it. So we have a member of the US Congress who took it, Beto O'Rourke. You might have seen him on national TV. He was recently on Bill Maher. He appears frequently on CNN. He is a congressman from Texas. So he's someone who took the Pro-Truth Pledge. Politicians who take the Pro-Truth Pledge and other public figures are held accountable by private citizens like yourself who took the Pro-Truth Pledge. Any one of you, if you choose to take the Pro-Truth Pledge, you can hold public figures accountable. And those who have been found to share misinformation have retracted and clarified their statements. So Johnny Martin, for example, gave a speech at the University of Arizona where he's running for the Arizona House. And he made some incorrect statements in his speech, and he publicly retracted those on Facebook. Michael Smith also made a public retraction. I can go into that in details. It addresses misinformation by the media. So we talked about the difference between Occupy Democrats and New York Times, or on the right between Breitbart and Wall Street Journal, which is a good, high-quality center-right newspaper. Many journalists took it already. So, for example, Ethan Behrman, who is the number 57 rated talk show host by Talkers Magazine, and Bob Fitarakis, who is the editor of the Columbus Free Press, a newspaper agency. So we use the Pro-Truth Pledge to differentiate credible journalists from hacks. So this is a great aspect of the Pro-Truth Pledge for politicians, for journalists, for other public figures. You can use it to differentiate which public figures actually care about truth and facts and want to be held accountable for being truthful, and which ones don't. Now, I'm often asked, by what does the pledge consider misinformation? So we consider misinformation anything that conveys information in an obviously deceptive way. And this was an example of the 18 school shootings. No, when people think school shooting, they think what happened in Parkland. They don't think of accidental discharge of a firearm after hours in a school by a security officer. That's not a school shooting. So this is an example of misinformation. In tough calls, we rely on credible fact-checking websites and the scientific consensus. The pledge combines, based on behavioral science, rewards and accountability. Public figures are rewarded, organizations as well. So we have an organizations that took it. There are a number of local humanist organizations, free thinkers who took it. The Humanist Association of Connecticut can take it as an organization, as can individual members of it. Public figures and organizations are rewarded with a positive reputational boost. All of them are listed on the Pro-Truth Pledge website as taking the Pro-Truth Pledge, and they can list and do list on their own websites that they took the Pro-Truth Pledge. They get a reputation boost. And private citizens who take the pledge hold accountable public figures through an evaluation process, which we can talk about. So this essentially functions like the Better Business Bureau, but for truth instead of business practices. The Better Business Bureau holds businesses accountable for truthful business or ethical business practices, whereas the Pro-Truth Pledge holds politicians and other public figures, journalists, and so on accountable. Now, the key here is being public. The key is to unite all people who care about the truth, all of them, all of us who care about truth and facts, all who want to fix our broken information system. We reach across the political spectrum, across the religious spectrum, across any spectrum you want to talk about. We have all sorts of people who took the Pro-Truth Pledge. Now, the Pro-Truth Pledge, it's not a single, petition. You sign it and forget it. This is part of a broader movement. This is part of a broader, much broader movement. So if you remember the environmental movement, we use it as our model. The environmental movement is working quite effectively to fix the broken system that enables pollution. And we are working to fix our broken information ecosystem that enables pollution of truth in public discourse. And there's hope. There's a lot of hope. In 1962, Rachel Carson published the book Silent Spring. In 1962. In 1970, in a bipartisan maneuver, Richard Nixon established the Environmental Protection Agency. That's 8 short years from the publication of this book, which is well known as the start of the modern environmental movement, to the establishment of the EPA. That's huge in terms of impact. And we can have a similar impact with the Pro-Truth movement. Now, there's already a book themed around the Pro-Truth movement called The Truth Seeker's Handbook, a science-based guide. I wrote it. And there were some other people who contributed to it. It's an Amazon bestseller already. You can find it on Amazon.com. It expands upon the Pro-Truth Pledge, the behaviors of the pledge. It talks about how you can recognize truth yourself, how to communicate truth to others effectively, and how to get others to accept the truth. There's a lot of things that it expands on in these 3 broad points, but that's what it's about in essence. So I want to encourage you to sign up. Every person who signs up gives incentives to public figures to sign, since it's more of a reputation boost. So the way we got Beto O'Rourke to sign is that we told him, hey, this is the number of constituents in Texas. He's running for, so he's already an incumbent congressman in Texas for El Paso, and he's trying to run for Senate. So he needs more name recognition. So there are a number of people in Texas who signed the pro-truth pledge, and we told him, here are all the people in Texas who signed it. Don't you want them to give you their votes, or consider giving you their votes, their money, their support? And he wanted to take it because of the number of constituents who signed. And that's the point of giving your address, so that we can show your elected representatives in Connecticut how many people took the pro-truth pledge in their district. And you can go to the pro-truth pledge website, and you can put in any district in the US to show how many people took it. I want you to consider being a part of the solution to cleaning up the pollution of truth and fighting fake news. I want you to join the pro-truth movement to defend against foreign domestic threats, like Russia and its propaganda machine, and domestic threats, people who deliberately mislead the American public. Unfortunately, the American public is all too vulnerable to being misled. And I want to ask you, is there any reason to not sign the pro-truth pledge? Any reason that any of you have? Please tell me. I would like to know. I rarely get an answer to this question if there's any reason to not sign. So I want all of you to be part of the solution, and I hope you choose to be by taking the pro-truth pledge. I welcome your questions.
Questions? Pushback? Got no takers. You got one.
Can you tell us any Republicans who have signed the pledge?
Oh gosh, of course, plenty. Let's see. Yes, go ahead.
Especially from Fox News.
From Fox News. No, I don't think there's anyone from Fox News who signed it currently. But there are a number of people from, there are a number of Republicans who have signed it. So there was a number of candidates for office. Let me pull up individual names if you're curious about that. So, and give me a second to pull it up. So, for example, there was a Republican candidate for Congress whose name is Christopher Peters, who has signed the pro-truth pledge and is quite public about signing it. There are other Republican candidates for other areas who have signed the pro-truth pledge. So this is, let me share. So this is, and there are a number of Republicans. So again, at the level of candidates for Congress who have signed it, and many local officials. There are over 100 politicians who signed it, many Republicans as well as Democrats. There are many Republicans. I mean, if you follow politics, you know that there are a number of Republicans who are choosing to resign from Congress right now, partially because of their opposition to the politics of Donald Trump, the post-truth politics of Donald Trump. People like Jeff Flake and so on, who don't want to be part of that problem. There are other people who are choosing to stay in Congress and fight against these post-truth politics. People like Lindsey Graham and John McCain, who are oriented toward truth and facts, and who really don't like the current environment of post-truth politics. So there are plenty of Republicans who signed, and they want to be part of the movement. We also have plenty of religious people who signed. There is a conservative Christian pastor who signed the pro-truth pledge. His name is Lorenzo O'Neill. He wrote a blog about why he signed. This is part of we have people across the political spectrum and the religious spectrum who signed the pro-truth pledge.
Lindsey Graham and John McCain are two of the biggest hypocrites that exist in the American Congress. They lie through their teeth. Lip service is cheap. Lindsey Graham voted for repeal of Obamacare. Voted against it the first time. When push came to shove, he signed it. So I wouldn't look at Lindsey Graham or John McCain as truthful individuals. Some years ago, I looked something up about John McCain. John McCain was always viewed as the friend of the veteran. If you look at his voting record in the Senate, what you find is that every time a bill came to the floor that would have been to the benefit of the veterans and the military, voted against it. It's in the record. So
I'm not trying at all to defend John McCain or Lindsey Graham, and I'm not, that's not a discussion I want to have. My point was that they have been critical, very vocally critical, of fake news, post-truth politics, Trump attacking the media. They've been quite vocally critical of that, and I'm glad that they have been. We want people like that who are critical of that. Now, whether they are otherwise truthful or deceptive, I don't have enough expertise to answer that question, and that's not a conversation that I want to have.
Yes, I have a question. You said that a conservative Christian pastor signed on to this document. So isn't the good news fake news?
I'm sorry? I'm not sure I heard that.
She's asking me, isn't the good news fake news?
Okay. Yeah, so what we have, the pro-truth pledge only applies to statements made about public discourse. We don't, one of the reasons that religious people can sign on is that it doesn't apply to religious statements. It doesn't apply to the religious statements that aren't about public discourse, like, God is real or something like that. It also doesn't apply to private statements like, if my wife is wearing a dress and she asks me if it makes her look fat, I might not answer truthfully.
Isn't that correct?
So that's so we exempt statements, if we exempt those sorts of statements that made in semi-private settings, private settings, statements that don't refer to public discourse. Those are not statements that are covered by the pro-truth pledge. Like I said, in the same way that Americans United for the Separation of Church and State is currently run by Reverend, I forget his name, but is currently run by a Reverend. In the same way, the pro-truth pledge welcomes all sorts of people, religious, secular, anything in between, as long as they make their public discourse statements based on facts.
Earlier, when you had the question and answer period, you were talking about certain people who had, there were politicians, Republicans who had lied, and the public was able to question them and get them to change it, or at least to be humiliated because they had lied. Isn't that the purpose of this program, that some liars will even sign this, but they can be questioned, held to account if they are a signer who has lied?
Right. So if a person who signs the pro-truth pledge makes a statement that is inaccurate, you can go at any time to the pro-truth pledge website and report that person. Now, we never presume that someone who makes an inaccurate statement actually intends to deceive. So, you can't read lying, just to be clear. For dictionary definition, lying means someone who is making an intentional, deliberate effort to deceive. Any one of us can make a false statement. I can cite, some source and it can be inaccurate. I can make a mistake. That's fine. So making a mistake is fine, as long as when the person is confronted, if I say that pi equals 2.14 instead of 3.14, whatever, that's an inaccurate statement. And if you tell me, hey, this is an accurate statement, I'm like, oh, okay, yes, thank you for helping correct me and celebrate updating my beliefs. It's the 12th behavior of the pro-truth pledge. That's great. So, and I gave some examples where Johnny Martin, who is running for the House in Arizona. And he, by the way, for curiosity's sake, he's a practicing Muslim. He made an inaccurate statement and he corrected his statement. Now, what we do, what you can do if you join the Pro-Truth Pledge is you can monitor the over 500 public figures who took the Pro-Truth Pledge, and they include very many secular luminaries, people like Peter Singer, Steven Pinker, Jonathan Haidt, Herb Silverman, August Brunsman. I can go on and on. So the very many prominent secular leaders have taken the Pro-Truth Pledge because they believe in it and they want to support this effort. And they are already oriented toward truth and facts. So you can hold accountable any of them, as well as any of the over 100 politicians who took the Pro-Truth Pledge. You can look at them and see whether they're actually telling the truth or not. And if you notice that any one of them is saying something that goes against the Pro-Truth Pledge, you can report them on the Pro-Truth Pledge website. That's how the Pro-Truth Pledge functions. It's like the Better Business Bureau. It holds people accountable because customers report on the Better Business Bureau website any complaints they have about the business. So that's how the Pro-Truth Pledge functions. And you can become a volunteer and you can become one of the evaluators if that's something that you wish to do. So this is the dynamics. Public figures are held accountable. I can go in depth into the accountability process if you wish. That's one dynamic. And they're given credit in the form of reputation for taking the Pro-Truth Pledge.
You have a recommendation for how to respond to someone who tells you something is fact, and when you ask them their source, they tell you, I saw it on Fox News. And then they ask you, what makes you think it's wrong? And you say, I read the truth in the New York Times. What do you say to them?
It's a great question. So what you want to do is you want to look specifically where in Fox News, have them find it, and you find the New York Times, and you see what it has been cited, what are the actual facts at hand. Let's say the statement is about an interpretation. I mean, there was a recent thing with Clinton and the uranium ore crisis, something like that. You look at the actual evidence below that. What are the facts being cited by Fox News? What are the facts being cited by the New York Times? And where the facts lie. So you want to dig down into the actual source and evaluate the source. You don't want to argue about whether Fox News or New York Times is more accurate, because that will just get you into emotions. You want to dig down and you want to say that you're really curious. These show you the article or the news segment from Fox News where they have this piece of information. And so dig down into the article, work together with this person to evaluate the quality of the article, and you evaluate the quality of the article in New York Times. That gives you an opportunity to see and show her or him how to actually evaluate the quality of an article. You want to teach a person to fish rather than give them a fish. That's going to be much more effective going down the road, rather than just arguing about what's better, Fox News or New York Times.
Do you have any tricks on tricking Facebook's algorithms so that they don't constantly give you back what you like? So if you're a liberal and you like a lot of liberal articles, and you just keep seeing more and more and more of them, then I want to get away from that bias and I want to see something from the other side. So how do you trick the Facebook algorithms?
So the main way to do that is to click like on conservative articles, not on liberal articles, regardless of what you actually like. So when you click like or heart, you want to do that on conservative articles, and that will help you go to conservative Facebook pages, go to Fox News, go to something like that. If you can't tolerate Fox News, go to Wall Street Journal or National Review, and then click like on those articles. And if you like them, heart them, then Facebook will show you more of that. It responds to your behavior. So if it sees you behaving in a certain way, it will respond to that.
For some time, I've I and friends of mine on the left and friends of mine on the right have relied on Snopes to resolve issues of what's true and what's fake news. I know, I understand that at this point only a limited fraction of people, a small percentage actually use Snopes, but I'm wondering what your thoughts are on the possibility of expanding Snopes itself or making something like Snopes that will be used on a wider scale.
So unfortunately, as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, only 12% or so of Republicans trust fact checkers like Snopes or PolitiFact or factcheck.org. Only 12%. Your friends are probably reflect you. They're probably intellectual, philosophical, they're quite smart, so they're probably in the 12%. But you're not really going to be effective if you try to expand that number. They will argue against you. What research shows is much more effective is to get Republicans as well as Democrats to commit to truth-oriented behaviors in advance. That's what the Pro-Truth Pledge is about. If you show the Pro-Truth Pledge to Republicans, you sign the Pro-Truth Pledge and you go out of here, you take some copies and you tell Republican friends, hey, here are these behaviors. Do you think these behaviors are oriented toward truthfulness? They're probably going to tell you, yeah, these behaviors are oriented toward truthfulness. And then you tell them, how about you sign these behaviors? And they go like, okay, well, yeah, I'll commit to these behaviors. And then next time when you have a conversation with them, you ask them to make sure to stick to these behaviors if they're not sticking to these behaviors. So you make it not about a source. You don't make it about a specific fact checker. That's not a way that you'll win going forward. You make it about behaviors that are very simple, very clear, and understandable as truth-oriented behaviors. That's the way to go forward. That's what the research shows is effective.
Okay. Wave at me if you've got more questions.
So I wanted to ask one question.
You got one.
Yeah, I was wondering, is fake news mainly a problem disseminated by social media, or are there also mainstream media that have been guilty of being careless with facts? I was curious, like, what sources in mainstream media you tend to hold are the most reliable, like factually reliable? One thing I was curious about is, like, for instance, I know that, for instance, the New York Times generally takes a liberal view in editorials. Would you say its articles that are purport to be factual nevertheless give a consistent factual view, or do they tend to have a liberal slant too? And like the Wall Street Journal, you say, I know that their editorials obviously are very conservative, but would you say that their factual information tends to be factual? I was curious, in other words,
Sure.
Are the mainstream media infected with fake news, with news getting facts wrong, or is it more a problem of social media?
It's much more a problem of social media. If you look at mainstream media, like the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times, their editorials tend to be on the left. The Wall Street Journal, their editorials tend to be on the right. Their articles tend to be more centrist with a slight lean in either direction. The Wall Street Journal will have a center-right lean. The New York Times articles will have a center-left lean. More their analysis articles than their fact articles. But their analysis articles would have a certain lean. If you want to just look at articles that have absolute or very, very little lean in either direction, you can look at Reuters or AP News. So both of those, their articles are just kind of, they're talking about the facts, they don't do analysis or very little analysis. So you're more likely to get very just fact-based articles. Partially because Reuters and AP News have articles that are carried by local newspapers around the country, and they want to make sure that these local newspapers around the country can use their articles whether their audience is left or right. So they have a strong incentive to keep their articles as factual as possible. So in general, mainstream media don't have that many fake news. What does happen sometimes is mainstream media that that try to break news very quickly, and those would be things like CNN and Fox News and MSNBC. Because they rush to publish, they have 24-hour news cycles, so they're always broadcasting news. They can sometimes bring a story and post a story, talk about a story that later turns out to be incorrect. So you have more risk there with those 24-hour cable news networks of either side, of any side. But mainly fake news is a social media phenomenon.
Does your pledge in any way address the, I find a lot of people will say to me, did you see the article? And what they're really referring to is an opinion piece or a letter to the editor, which is a whole different standard than a news article, and they fail to differentiate. Is there anything on your site that addresses that if you can point it?
Absolutely. One of the behaviors of the pro-truth pledge is differentiate between your opinions and the facts. And that relates specifically in news sources, of course, to editorials. So that's clarifying. So you want people distinguishing between their opinions and the facts. And studies we've done at Ohio State University show that people who take the pro-truth pledge are much more likely to align with all of these behaviors, including clarifying between their opinion and the facts, which includes, of course, clarifying between op-eds and letters to the editor and factual articles.
Anyone else? Oh, okay.
Make you walk back.
No, my bad strategy.
Is the pledge only for American news, or is this worldwide?
It's a worldwide movement. So some of the people I mentioned earlier who took the pro-truth pledge, let's say Peter Singer. Peter Singer is an Australian philosopher, an Australian moral philosopher. And Michael Shermer both is in the UK and in the US, and others are as well. Steven Pinker is Canadian. So this is mainly, this is a global phenomenon. About 80%, it started in the US, about 80% of our signers are in the US, but then the next biggest ones are Canada, UK, Australia, and Brazil. So this is a global phenomenon, and post-truth politics and fake news is a problem for the whole world.
I have a very practical question. What do you do with the names and addresses and email addresses that you gather? What kind of database do they go into? And do you sell it or give it away?
No, we don't sell them. We don't give them away. They are in the Pro-Truth Pledge website database. What we do is, when we go to people like Beto O'Rourke, we show them how many people in their constituents, among their potential constituents, or existing constituents if they're an incumbent, how many of them signed the Pro-Truth Pledge. We don't actually give them the addresses so that they can't, bug you for mailing you. But we show them the addresses. We show them, here are the 500 people in your district who signed the Pro-Truth. In fact, I can show you. Let me do a screen share. So we go to the Pro-Truth. Can everyone see the Pro-Truth Pledge website right now? Yes?
Yeah.
So you go to Pledge Takers, and you enter an address. So I'll enter my address. Now you'll all know where I live. And so you can see how many people for all of my elected representatives took the Pro-Truth Pledge. For my address, 450 Wetmore Road, Columbus, Ohio. Donald Trump is the president. There are nearly 4,000 people who are his constituents who took the pro-truth pledge. So that means all US citizens. Then Rob Portman, he's my senator. So is Sherrod Brown. So that means that for the whole of Ohio, and John Kasich is the governor, 853 people took the pro-truth pledge. And then you look at, let's say, 553 people in Franklin County, which is the county in which I live. Then this is the city of Columbus, 305 people in the city of Columbus. So all of that we can get because you give us your address. The same thing would happen in Connecticut. You know, if you give us, I don't know, Connecticut addresses, but if you put in an address in Connecticut, you can see how many people for that address took the pro-truth pledge. And with that information, we can approach your elected representative and we can say, hey, elected representative, how about you put your information, you know, someone from your district here in the pledge takers form, and we can show you how many people in your district took the pro-truth pledge. So that's where your information goes. It's all on the back end of the website, and it's used to demonstrate to elected representatives how many people in their district took the pro-truth pledge, because it's all about bean counting. It's all about number counting for them. You know, how many people is it worth it, makes it worth it for them to take the pro-truth pledge and be restricted by the behaviors of the pro-truth pledge, because it does restrict their freedom, and they can't, you know, they can't misinform anymore. So if they did previously, they have to be restricted now. So you have to make it worth it for them. You have to say, these are the rewards you get for being truthful, for being held accountable. So the more numbers we have, the more people take the pro-truth pledge, the more worthy it is for them to take the pro-truth pledge as well.
I want to thank you very much for a wonderful program and all the tremendous work you've done to make so we can do a better job of keeping our representatives accountable. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. And I welcome and encourage all of you to sign the pro-truth pledge that's in your hands right now and tear out the bottom strip. You can take the top with you. So you can tear out the bottom strip and give it to Carol. Carol will send me a photo of all the people who signed the pro-truth pledge. Then she'll discard and destroy your addresses, and then we'll have a volunteer put them into the website. We need as many people as possible to sign the pro-truth pledge and become part of the movement, to get your elected representatives to take the pro-truth pledge, to get people in your media to take the pro-truth pledge, and to be a model, a public model, to send a public signal that you care about truth and facts and be part of the community, be part of the pro-truth movement. And I hope you do that and are part of the solution to fake news and post-truth politics. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gleb.